September 1, 1939. Washington, D.C. The rain fell softly over the Capitol, blurring the outlines of monuments that celebrated past victories while Europe burned an ocean away. Inside the War Department, the air smelled of paper, ink, and stale tobacco. Typewriters clicked. Shoes echoed along polished floors. On the surface, the United States Army looked calm, professional, confident. Beneath it, something far more dangerous lingered: complacency. The Army had not failed yet. That was the problem. In a small, sparsely furnished office, George Catlett Marshall sat alone at his desk. No aides hovered nearby. No advisors whispered into his ear. Before him lay a thin folder. Inside it were not battle plans or intelligence reports. There were names: senior officers, decorated men, generals whose stars had been earned decades earlier, in a different war, against a different enemy, under different rules. Marshall did not rush. He never rushed. He had spent weeks listening instead of speaking, watching instead of commanding. He had attended field exercises without comment, his expression unreadable, as units maneuvered according to doctrines born in the trenches of 1918. He had read, after action, reports others dismissed. He had noticed how decisions slowed as they climbed the chain of command, how innovation died under the weight of seniority. Outside that office, most Americans believed the Atlantic would protect them. Inside, Marshall understood time would not. This was the moment when the future of the American Army quietly tilted, though no one yet felt the shift. If stories like this matter to you, stories about decisions made before the first shot was fired, subscribe to WWII Frontline Legends and tell us where you're watching from around the world. History was shaped in rooms like this, long before it was shaped on battlefields. Marshall rose from his chair and walked to the window. Beyond it, the city moved as if nothing had changed. Yet across the ocean, Poland was being crushed under steel and fire. Blitzkrieg was not a theory anymore. It was reality. And the United States Army, for all its proud lineage, was not ready to face it. On paper, the Army ranked among the world's largest institutions. In reality, it was smaller than Portugal's. Its equipment was outdated. Its tanks were slow. Its air support doctrine was fragmented. Promotions flowed upward not by brilliance or adaptability, but by time served. Men who had mastered the last war controlled the shape of the next. Marshall knew this structure intimately. He had lived inside it for 4 decades. He knew its strengths. He knew its fatal weaknesses. And he knew something else, something few dared admit. The next war would not forgive hesitation. In training grounds across the country, exercises played out the same way. Orders were rigid. Initiative was discouraged. Officers waited for permission that arrived too late. Mistakes were buried under paperwork. No one wanted to be the man who challenged a general with 30 years of service. Marshall watched all of it without comment. Some mistook his silence for indecision. Others assumed he agreed with what he saw. They were wrong on both counts. At night, long after the building emptied, Marshall returned to his office and opened the folder again. One by one, he read the names. He did not hate these men. Many were competent. Some were brilliant by old standards. But Marshall was not planning for the past. He was preparing for a war that would move faster than anyone expected. Outside his office, whispers had already begun. His appointment as chief of staff had surprised many. He lacked the flamboyance of other generals. He avoided politics. He did not cultivate allies. He did not charm Congress. What he did instead unsettled people. He listened. And when he spoke, he chose his words carefully, as if each one carried weight. In the corridors of power, a quiet question circulated. What was Marshall really doing? The answer did not arrive with an announcement. It arrived through sealed envelopes and private meetings. A general summoned, thanked for his service, and informed his command would end. Another reassigned to a desk with no influence. Another quietly retired. No accusations. No scandals. Just endings. The Army had not failed yet. That was still the danger. Some officers accepted their fate with dignity. Others were stunned. A few were furious. They had expected to lead America into any future conflict. They had expected their stars to protect them. They had underestimated Marshall. As the removals continued, anxiety spread through the War Department. Men who had once felt untouchable began to glance over their shoulders. Conversations lowered. Doors closed. Congressmen asked questions that went unanswered. Newspapers hinted at upheaval without understanding its scope. Marshall did not explain himself. He did not defend his actions publicly. He did not reassure critics. Silence was his shield. To those watching from the outside, it looked reckless. Europe was at war. Japan was expanding across Asia. And America's chief of staff appeared to be dismantling his own leadership. Some whispered that he was gambling with national survival. Others believed he had misjudged the moment. A few suspected something darker, that Marshall had lost faith in the institution he served. None of them knew what he was really doing. He was making room. In the spaces left behind by departing generals, unfamiliar names began to surface. Officers without famous surnames. Men who argued too much. Men who wrote reports challenging accepted doctrine. Men who had been sidelined precisely because they thought differently. Marshall noticed them all. He remembered a lieutenant colonel obsessed with armored warfare, dismissed by peers as arrogant. He remembered a planner who questioned assumptions and irritated superiors with blunt assessments. He remembered an officer who spoke less about glory and more about supply lines, ports, and distances measured in oceans. These men did not fit the old mold. That was the point. Yet even as he elevated new voices, Marshall felt the weight of uncertainty pressed down on him. There were no guarantees, no rehearsals for decisions of this magnitude. If he was wrong, the cost would not be his career alone. It would be paid in blood. Late one evening, as he prepared to leave his office, Marshall paused beside his desk. The folder still lay there, thinner now than before. He closed it carefully, as if sealing a private pact with the future. The Army still had not failed, but it soon would be tested. And when that test came, there would be no time to undo what had been done. As doubts crept through Washington and the world edged closer to catastrophe, one question hung unspoken in the air. Had Marshall just saved the Army, or quietly doomed it before the first shot was fired? If you're watching this unfold and feeling the weight of that question, stay with WWII Frontline Legends. Subscribe and let us know where you're watching from, because the next decisions would echo across continents, and history was about to demand answers. The removals did not slow. They accelerated. By early 1940, the War Department had become a place of quiet fear. The hallways looked the same. The routines continued. But the confidence that once filled senior offices had evaporated. Every phone call felt heavier. Every summons carried an unspoken question. Was this the end of a career built over 30 years? Marshall never raised his voice. He never humiliated anyone. That, perhaps, was what unsettled them most. A general would enter his office expecting confrontation and leave with polite words, a firm handshake, and the knowledge that everything he had worked toward was over. No explanation followed. No appeal existed. The decision was final. Outside observers struggled to understand what was happening. America was still officially at peace. There had been no disastrous defeat, no scandal, no public failure demanding reform. And yet the Army's highest ranks were being hollowed out from within. This was not a purge born of panic. It was a purge born of foresight. Marshall had seen something others had not. He had watched German formations move with speed and coordination unseen in the last war. He had read reports from observers who described armored thrusts that shattered rigid defenses in days. He understood that future battles would not be decided by how long an officer had worn a uniform, but by how quickly he could think when the plan collapsed. The old Army resisted that idea with quiet stubbornness. Its doctrine valued control over initiative. Orders flowed downward and were obeyed without question. That system had worked when wars moved slowly. It would fail catastrophically when they did not. Inside Marshall's mind, the threat was no longer foreign armies. It was institutional paralysis. Some of the men removed were war heroes. Others were gifted administrators. None were villains. That was what made the decision unbearable. Marshall was not cutting away weakness. He was cutting away certainty, the comfort of familiar leadership, the illusion that experience alone could solve what was coming. As the months passed, criticism intensified. Senators asked why proven leaders were being sidelined. Editorials questioned whether Marshall was dismantling the army out of pride. Rumors spread that personal grudges were driving decisions. Marshall responded to none of it. Silence again was his shield. Behind closed doors, however, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Officers whispered about survival. Younger men hesitated to speak openly, unsure whether boldness would elevate them or end them. The army felt unsteady, as if its foundation had been deliberately shaken. And that was exactly what Marshall wanted. He believed an institution that could not survive internal pressure would not survive war. At Fort Benning, training exercises were rewritten. At Fort Knox, armor doctrine was challenged openly. Reports once buried were now circulated. Mistakes were dissected instead of hidden. Officers were encouraged, quietly at first, to argue. Not everyone welcomed this shift. Some saw it as chaos, others as disrespect. But Marshall watched closely, noting who adapted and who clung to rank. He did not reward agreement. He rewarded clarity, the ability to see a problem and confront it without fear. If you're still listening at this point, you already understand this was not about ambition or ego. This was about lives that would one day depend on decisions made in silence. If you value stories like this, subscribe to WWII Frontline Legends and tell us where you're watching from. The consequences of these choices were moving closer with every passing month. Then came the moment when doubt reached its peak. In the spring of 1941, reports from Europe painted a grim picture. France had fallen with shocking speed. Armies thought unbeatable had collapsed in weeks. Critics in Washington pointed to Marshall's reshaping of the army and asked whether America was now weaker, not stronger. They looked at young officers promoted beyond their experience. They saw arguments instead of unity. They saw an army that seemed unfinished. What they did not see was the structure forming beneath the surface. Marshall began elevating men who had never commanded large formations. Dwight Eisenhower, a planner without battlefield glory, suddenly found himself trusted with strategic thinking at the highest level. George Patton, brilliant and abrasive, was given room to innovate instead of being sidelined for his temperament. Omar Bradley, methodical and quiet, was noticed not for his rank, but for his judgment. These choices shocked the old guard. They were men without legendary names, men without political protection, men who had failed at times, learned, and adapted. Marshall knew something his critics did not. War would expose weaknesses brutally. Better to reveal them now, in training rooms and arguments, than later, under fire. Still, uncertainty gnawed at him. Late at night, when Washington slept, Marshall reviewed reports alone. Exercises that succeeded one day failed the next. Promising officers made mistakes. The army he was shaping was alive, learning, but unproven. There were moments when even he wondered whether he had moved too far, too fast. He never voiced those doubts. By the end of 1941, the army no longer resembled the institution Marshall had inherited. Its leadership was younger, its thinking sharper, its culture restless. To some, it looked dangerous. To Marshall, it looked ready to be tested. That test arrived without warning. On a quiet December morning, radios crackled with news from across the Pacific. Pearl Harbor burned. Battleships lay broken. America was at war. There would be no more debates about preparedness. No more second chances. The Army would either prove Marshall right or expose his greatest failure. As mobilization surged and units deployed, observers braced for collapse. They expected confusion. They expected disaster. They expected the untested leadership to break under pressure. It did not. Instead, the Army adapted with a speed that surprised even its architects. Mistakes were acknowledged. Lessons were learned quickly. Officers argued, adjusted, and moved forward. The friction Marshall had encouraged became momentum. Still, questions lingered. Had this outcome been inevitable? Or had Marshall merely been lucky? As operations expanded across oceans and continents, the men he had removed faded quietly into history. Their absence was noted only in retrospect. The men he had elevated now stood at the center of events that would decide the war. Yet even as success mounted, an uncomfortable thought remained. History does not reveal the paths not taken. It does not show what might have happened if one dismissed general had remained, if one promotion had gone differently. If you've followed this far, you're already standing at the edge of that question. Stay with WWII Frontline Legends, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Because the final reckoning of Marshall's gamble would not be written in memos or promotions, but in victory, loss, and the silence that followed the guns. The war would prove the Army's strength, but it would never fully answer whether the risk that created it was genius or something far more dangerous. The war unfolded faster than anyone in Washington had predicted. In North Africa, American forces stumbled into combat underprepared and overconfident. Early defeats exposed gaps in coordination, judgment, and command. Critics seized on those moments as proof that the Purge had gone too far. They argued that experience had been discarded in favor of theory, that Marshall's gamble was finally coming due. But the story did not end there. What happened next revealed the quiet logic behind the risk. The Army did not deny its failures. It absorbed them. Units were reorganized. Commanders were replaced without hesitation. Tactics were rewritten in real time. Where older systems would have hidden mistakes to preserve rank and reputation, this new Army dissected them mercilessly. Pride mattered less than survival. That shift, subtle but profound, traced back to decisions made years earlier in Washington offices where no gunfire had been heard. George Marshall watched from a distance. He did not command in the field. He did not claim credit. His role remained unchanged. He evaluated. He listened. He adjusted. Even as victories began to stack up, he never relaxed the standards he had imposed before the war. Some of the officers he had elevated failed under pressure. Marshall removed them just as decisively as he had removed the old guard. Rank was never a shield. Performance was the only currency that mattered. Across the Atlantic, the war in Europe demanded coordination on a scale never attempted. In the planning rooms of Britain, American officers worked alongside allies, negotiating egos as much as strategies. Dwight Eisenhower, once an obscure planner, now carried responsibility that would have crushed a less flexible system. He made mistakes. He learned. He adapted. That adaptability was not accidental. It had been cultivated deliberately. In the Pacific, logistics stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. Victory depended not only on courage, but on supply lines, timing, and coordination between services that had once barely spoken. Officers trained to think in rigid compartments struggled. Those trained to think broadly thrived. Again and again, the Army responded not with rigidity, but with evolution. Marshall understood something few leaders ever fully accept. War does not reward perfection. It rewards correction. The Purge generals were not remembered in headlines. Their absence did not announce itself on battlefields. Yet their removal had changed the atmosphere in which every decision was now made. Authority no longer flowed solely from age or reputation. It flowed from competence demonstrated under pressure. As the war pushed deeper into Europe, American forces faced their greatest test. Normandy demanded precision, coordination, and the ability to recover when plans unraveled. Nothing went exactly as intended. Weather intervened. Units landed off target. Communication broke down. And still, the Army held. Junior officers made decisions without waiting for orders that might never come. Commanders adjusted objectives on the fly. Initiative replaced hesitation. The culture Marshall had imposed years earlier revealed its true purpose. This was not an army that waited to be told what to do. It was an army prepared to decide. Yet even as victory came into view, the moral weight of Marshall's choices did not lift. He knew that success could never fully justify risk. That victory does not erase the cost of decisions that might have gone another way. History tends to celebrate outcomes and forget probabilities. Marshall did not. In quiet moments, he reflected on the names he had crossed out. Men who might have adapted if given the chance. Men who might have failed catastrophically. He would never know. No one would. The war ended not with clarity, but with exhaustion. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead. America emerged victorious, its army respected and battle-hardened. The narrative solidified quickly. Marshall became a symbol of foresight. His purge was reframed as inevitability rather than gamble. But inevitability is a comfort history often invents after the fact. Marshall himself resisted that comfort. He never published a defense. He never wrote a memoir explaining the list. When asked about the decisions, he spoke in measured terms, deflecting praise and refusing to simplify choices that had never felt simple. Those who knew him understood why. He had acted without certainty. He had chosen risk over familiarity. He had dismantled a system before it failed, knowing that if he was wrong, the consequences would be irreversible. The army that emerged victorious was not the army of 1939. It was faster, harsher, more adaptable. It bore the imprint of decisions made long before bullets flew. Decisions that could not be tested in advance. Decisions that depended entirely on judgment. And still, one question lingered beneath the triumph. What if the war had unfolded differently? What if early defeats had multiplied instead of teaching lessons? What if friction had turned into fragmentation? What if one dismissed general had possessed the insight that could have prevented catastrophe? History does not answer those questions. It only records outcomes. Marshall accepted that silence. He understood that leadership sometimes means carrying uncertainty forever, without resolution or applause. He understood that the most important battles are often fought without witnesses. The list that once lay on his desk vanished into archives. The names faded. The consequences endured. Today, the story of the Purge is often told as proof that bold leadership shapes destiny. But the truth is more fragile than that. It rests on a knife edge between vision and disaster, between courage and recklessness. Marshall walked that edge alone. And as the world moved on, the army he reshaped became a standard by which future forces would be judged, even as the risk that created it slipped quietly into the background. If this story made you pause, if it made you question how unseen decisions shape the world you inherit, then you already understand why these moments matter. Subscribe to WWII Frontline Legends and tell us where you're watching from around the world, because history is not only written by those who fight, but by those who decide long before the fighting begins.